All right, the BB48 family. I'm back with another one. Earlier this morning, I kind of touched on a topic where I reposted a clip, and you can check my story out to see which clip I'm talking about. But I mentioned this book, The Destruction of Black Civilizations. In my estimation, it is one of the required readings for all conscious African people, all unconscious African people, all African people need to study and read this book, in my estimation. But anyway, I mentioned the Mossi states and their principle that addressed the concept of us tolerating in our midst our enemies, Eurasian um, peoples, if you will. And I want to just take one moment and read the first 3 pages addressing the remarkable Mossi states, the empire, one of the 10 civilization Nana Chancellor Williams addresses in Destruction of Black Civilization. So it starts on page 209. The remarkable Mossi. They never called it an empire. They called it the Mossi states. We let it go at that. But it was, in fact, an empire, if the same definition is applied as it is in other areas of the world. It was a union of kingdoms, similar to other core groups whose expansionist proclivities create empires. It differed markedly in the pattern of centralized authority. The traditional African political system that we go showing you that no matter where we are, that African worldview, that African constitution, the traditional African political system. So when people try to overemphasize the diversities present in Africa by way of, tribalism or what have you, or different dialects, there's still something that ties us and binds us together as one African people. Our traditions, our ethos, our worldview. That African constitution that Nana Chancellor Williams talks about, that is common in each of those civilizations he talks about in the destruction of black civilizations. Each of them share this in common. So to make the point that we're not a monolith as an African people, no people are really a monolith. Shit, no people, individuals are monolithic. You disagree with yourself every day. Europeans have a worldview that agrees to dominate and oppress you as an African being. And we must have a worldview that says we must resist our enemies. But we get so caught up in these factions and dialects and tribalism and cliquish and you're one African people when we realize that, which is one of the things I realized after studying the destruction of black civilization. What is that common thing that constantly is present as we see our own people's demise, each civilization's demise, each organization's demise? What's that common theme? We have to see ourselves as one African people. But back to the reading. It says the traditional African political system of local autonomy was maintained in the independence of the individual states that made up the empire. There were 5 core kingdoms: Ouagadougou, Yatinga, Fadagurma, Mamprusi, and Dagomba. Each had become a kingdom independently of the others, each as powerful as the other. The union of the states was inspired by the bonds of kinship, a common Mossi origin. If you read Destruction of Black Civilization, you'll see that most of the oral traditions of the several civilizations that are being covered or talked about, they kind of include a common origin story, or common ancestor. Although located southward between the great arms of the Niger River and almost surrounded by the expanding empires of Mali and Songhai, neither was able to subdue and bring the Mossi within the empire. Quite the contrary. With the greatest and the most dashing cavalry forces in Africa, the Mossi carried the war to them. Here's about to be a critical point to be made. And when we talk about how traditional African centered people in their African minds, as opposed to Europeans and Asians and this westward idea of expansion and conquering and colonizing and taking over a people's land and that group of people. Here's where we differ. He's going to make this point on page 210. He says, the Mossi nation is another case study because it is also a typical example of migrating blacks who united to form new and larger political entities, conquered the people whose homeland they invaded, and at the same time showed wide cultural variations while holding steadfastly to the fundamentals of African constitutional principles. They were reflected not only in the political organization of African states, but also in the conqueror's respect for the land rights of those whose original homeland it was. In short, the rights of the conquest did not include ownership of the land, a fundamental constitutional principle. That's a European phenomenon, that this one person can have privately owned property. This individualistic concept of wealth consumption, property consumption. But that was a lot to unpack in that. So he addresses the African constitutional principles, in other words, African worldview, being reflected in the principles that all of these, he goes all the way in this book. You get Queen Nzinga, you get Menes, the first king of the Egyptian empires, because he unites Upper and Lower Egypt. He talks about, so that's Egypt. You get Queen Nzinga all the way down here. He talks about Shaka, Zulu. He talks about a lot of people in here, right? But what he's showing yet is that no matter where you see our civilizations, there's a common theme of reverence. There's a core values, a list of things which he calls an African constitutional principles. Or in other words, our worldview being that really is the spelling out, if you will, of our worldview in many ways. It's what makes us all one African people, that common asili, that connectedness, that concept of the world and how we feel about a thing collectively. So we don't need to necessarily have a grand meeting to say, oh, this is how I feel about X, Y, and Z. But if you are grounded into these African-centered principles, we're all going to be doing and working toward the same common goal. All right. Then he goes on to say, I have emphasized the difference between two main types of migrations: the slow and almost leisurely movements of people over countless centuries because of the no longer tolerable conditions of climate and soil, and the stepped-up migrations amounting to refugee flights because of increasing invasions from Asia and Europe. It is these latter causes with which we are now dealing. So the Mossi states are a result of the latter causes for migrations. In this book, you'll learn a lot of the reasons for the many different dialects and cultural makeups that you see, the diversity in Africa. It was due to several, eons of Asiatic incursions, and then also migratory patterns were the result of things being changed in the climate, in the terrain, the Sahara, growing or what have you. So he's saying here, the slow and almost leisurely movements of people over countless centuries because of the no longer tolerable conditions of climate and soil, and the stepped-up migrations amounting to refugee flights because of increasing invasions from Asia and Europe. It is these latter causes with which we are now dealing with. So that was the reason why you'd see a new empire be formed, or states being formed, because people are moving and migrating as a result of those two factors, oftentimes. And so then he goes on to say, they increased as the Arabs overran the eastern Sudan and became a period of crises between the 12th and the 17th centuries. This was the long period during which migrating blacks undertook to form new and stronger states all over the continent, succeeding while other refugee blacks found themselves in areas where just to survive at all required all the energy they could muster from day to day. Progress? What progress? How progress? Blessed, then, were the migrants who, unlike those, found territories where progress was possible. Because a lot of times you're dealing with a lot of different factors that's causing you to migrate. And so resettlement may be very difficult. Right? So he said, blessed were the Mossi. By 1500, they had become a dominant power and one of the most industrious nations of the period. The Africa-wide concept of the basis for legitimate rule was held to as a means of social control and national unification, as well as the basis for all authority, high or low. As elsewhere, it all traced back to the founders of the nation. In this case, and forgive me for my mispronunciation, but I'll spell it out. I'll attempt to pronounce it. Ouedraogo. Drago. It's Ouedraogo. And Oburi. That's spelled Oubri. The Nam, which is the God-given power to lead men. All of their descendants should inherit this power and therefore inherit the right to rule. Implicit in this, or certainly in the ideas developed from it, was the right to conquer and rule. The idea of royalty evolved from the same source, further illustrating how a fact and a commendable idea, such as honoring the founders of a nation, may be elaborated through time to a grand old myth. But in Mossi the Nam seems to have been carried to extremes. Everyone seeking recognition or even a minor office claimed to have the Nam. This bestowed the title of Naba, which is ruler, so-and-so. The extent to which the political structure was based upon the Nam made Mossi society somewhat unique among African states. Since the Nabas of the 5 core states claimed equality, so all of these, there were other smaller groups or states, if you will, that came up to make up the Mossi states. All right, so the other 5 core states claimed equality and were all fiercely independent in both spirit and action. The early contests were over what state should become the leader of them all and provide the Magoho Naba, which is the king of kings. So Ouagadougou finally won, although it was not senior in the Nam line of descent. Important point here. It won because it had become the center of economic activity and, therefore, national prosperity. And because the Ouagadougou people outdid themselves in screaming praise and praise songs for their Naba, who was the ruler of the whole world, his dominions were boundless. He was God's son and, therefore, sacred. No one must look upon his face. All must prostrate themselves before him. Supreme justice can be found only in our Magoho Naba. All of this was too much for the other states to overcome. The Ouagadougou Naba thus became the Magoho Naba of the United Mossi Kingdoms, principalities, and chiefdoms, each of which was virtually autonomous. The Magoho Naba had no real authority outside his own Ouagadougou kingdom. Unity was achieved through negotiations, friendly persuasion, or, all else failing, sometimes by force of arms. More national unity seems to have been achieved, however, because the various states voluntarily followed the successful example of Ouagadougou in social, economic, and political organization and the ritualistic splendor of a court. that claimed rulership of the world. But see, to me, even that, we can study these civilizations. We can study the Mossi states and see their principles, see where they thrive, but also see some of their limitations. Like even there being any fragmentation, any boundaries, any separations of this African body politic, to me, is disadvantageous for us. So it shouldn't have been a 5 states. I mean, like to me, it's all one state, one principle, one cause, one goal, one aim, one destiny. You know. So perhaps I'm a dreamer for trying to get such a diverse people to be monolithic in that regard. But he goes on to say, the political structure did not vary from the traditional African constitutional system. Again, this is what I want to argue to people who are trying to say, oh, you know, you can't just claim to be an African because Africans so diverse and, well, we're not Africans now. And bro, there's a constitution that is embedded in you as in your DNA. It's also called your worldview. But what happens is we can get our worldviews distorted once we accept a European mind. We get out of our minds. We lose our minds. And when we lose our minds, then we be a weapon against our own. So now you aren't an African. You're just a black man with a European mind. You're African entertaining and indulging in suffocating and drowning in insanities. So I go back to this because I love sentences like this. It proves my point. The political structure did not vary from the traditional African constitutional system, which he spells out in the text. He shows us the traditional African constitution. In other words, the African worldview that no matter if you was in the great city of Thebes or the ancient city, Egypt, Kemet, or you was in the South Sudan, Nubia, or you were in Ethiopia, any part of the Ethiopian empire, or you were in, anywhere you see this African constitution being honored. So we were always one African people, just forming new dialects by way of our adjusting to our resettlements. It would still be the same sort of language off of the mother tongue. All right, so the village chief and council, this is how the African Constitution is, the traditional African constitutional system, which includes the village chief and council, district chief or the Naba and council, the province governor or the Naba and council, and Magoho Naba and council. The Widi Naba or the prime minister was next in authority under the Magoho Naba. Each important minister in the national government was also the Naba, or the governor, of a province, another variation from traditional practice. Still, it's just variations, but it's still based on the tradition, the sense of the origin. Don't get it twisted. We still all one African people. We never have lost that until we lose that. And we lose that by our actions going against our traditional African selves. Of course, we must recover this, who our African selves are, by way of study. This is how you remember. And then you say, oh, this is natural. Oh, I'm no different than a black person that is so happen to have been born in Sacramento just because I was born in New York or I was born in Las Vegas. Like now my actions just must go back to supporting this African race. So I must study Garvey. I must study Nana Chancellor Williams, Nana Amos Wilson. And see, what did they say? How did they say? And what do I do? All right, so now we're on page 212, and I think this is where I wanted to make my point with their, the Mossi states had this principle, this proverb, if you will. I think it's here. All right, so there were other variations. Some were highly important. One was the minister of Muslims, for unlike so many other African societies, the migrating Mossi had learned something from the history of the blacks in their relations with Arab and Berber peoples. Now, mind you, I'm introducing something on this video that may be new to somebody if I were to just share this to somebody without giving you all the context. This is page 212. So by now, if you had read this book or you were in the process of it, you'd understand what he's referencing by the Arab incursions and the Berber people and learning how the Mossi people are learning from what other black civilizations and societies had and their histories with dealing with those outsiders, those aliens. No foreigners could settle in Mossi's territory. They made this a principle after having watched and learned and studied the history of their people. The reasons that caused them to have to resettle and make up and all of these smaller states come together and make one great big state was because we had to, adjust. We got pushed back from some Asiatic incursions or what have you. So we have to watch and study that, learn what happened. This is another, the chronic thing that keeps appearing every time you see our civilizations, our societies be destroyed. What happens? Are we studying how we entertain and deal with our enemies? How do we extinguish those fires that are our enemies? So the Mossi states comes up with this principle. They say, unlike so many other African societies, the migrating Mossi had learned something from the history of the blacks in their relations with Arab and Berber peoples. No foreigners could settle in Mossi territory. But since the Mossi themselves were great traders, they needed the far-flung outlets which the Muslims everywhere controlled. Here we go. Here we go. Here we go. But so Muslim traders were therefore admitted into the country under the strict supervision of the Ministry for Muslims. Even that right there, that's the slippery slope. That's the minis uniting Upper and Lower Egypt and still allowing those Asiatic folks to still be there and not totally expelling them. Not totally expelling them. Here we go. We leave these Arabs, we leave these Asiatics, these aliens, any of the Eurasians around, any of these insane Africans around to fester long enough. We'd be too nice, as my bro Mwale would say, xenophilic, accepting and inviting and welcoming of a diversity from outside. When we do that, it's the prerequisite, it's the slippery slope, it's the start of that snowball effect, which is our demise. The Mossi states will soon realize that, because what happens? Let's see. All Muslim activity was restricted to trade. So they learned. They like, look, if you let them get loose up in here, watch how they do. They're gonna start trading your men. They're gonna ask for more land. They're enslaving your people while they're trading and spreading their religion. Now they're conquering you, and now you find yourself in a pickle again. So here we go. All Muslim activity was restricted to trade. The religion of Islam was rejected. Conversion to both teaching and religion forbidden. In short, the Mossi saw Islam and Christianity as the white man's vehicles of conquest. It was the only black nation in time to see this. And we still dealing with it. Indeed, Mossi prophecy held that, this was the point I was trying to make. Mossi prophecy held that when the first white man appeared in the land, the nation would die. This is page 212 of The Destruction of Black Civilizations by Nana Chancellor Williams. Read this again. This is my favorite part, maybe of the whole book. Mossi prophecy held that when the first white man appeared in the land, the nation would die. That time had not yet arrived. The Mossi policy of excluding whites or rigidly limiting the number and controlling their activities in the country further illuminates an African experience that is already so clear that it should require no additional light. All African states that began to develop again after the great dispersions, rebuilding and expanding, were prosperous and advancing as black states, as long as they barred the relentless, aggressive whites from their countries. And their destruction became certain only when they abandoned this policy and let the Asians and Europeans in. On this, the record is entirely clear. The Mossi held on steadfastly to their own African religion and African institutions and survived over 500 years into the 20th century until it was finally overrun by France. A few more of these all-African institutions should be mentioned to further illustrate the external influence school. We are dealing with a land and a people where a white face would have been a curiosity and white influence even under the disguise of religion, was barred by law. I want to find the place where eventually talks about how talks about how our children, the children of the Mossi states, eventually started to say, "Oh, that whole principle, that's just some old wise tale." And whoopsie daisy, there you go. The Mossi states is overcome again, or just like we've seen with all the other civilizations, right? Okay, so it's on page 216. I know 216. I know this is it's a 4-page jump, but I found where I was talking about. So I'm gonna kind of jump to the page and to the part in the page where it's addressing what I'm saying. It was during the 19th century, however, that the Mossi exclusion of foreigners became less rigid, and there began a gradual relaxation of restrictions, especially of Muslim traders. They gave the Europeans the game. The Islamic traders gave the Europeans the game with how to come and colonize us, conquer us with Christianity, because they did it first, and they do it effectively. You must disavow all sorts of identity crisis, all of those. All right. Some were allowed to settle. Remember how rigid those rules were for those Muslims at first. Now they're allowed to settle. Look, that's it. Once that happens, all downhill from here. The Mossi States part of this book goes on for another page and a half. 2 pages and a half, excuse me. And that's it. And we started on page what? 209. We're at 216 right now. From this point on, we only have 2.5 pages left. That tells you what happens after you allow them to settle in. You become relaxed. You become more inviting and accepting of it. People telling you crazy because you all blackity black. But once you start to relax and you let the enemy in, that is the downfall, starting the snowball effect. Boom, 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 boom. All right, so listen at this. And while it is true that the vanguard were black Muslims from the now wholly Islamized neighboring black states that paved the way and made it smoother for the white Muslim brothers, their white Muslim brothers. Moreover, an increasing number of young modern Mossi leaders began to consider the age-old policy of excluding whites as unenlightened, if not downright uncivilized. What did a great military power, the greatest in Africa, have to fear from a few white faces in the land? But what about the great prophecy? When the first white man appeared in the land, the nation would die. Nothing in Mossi land was better known and more universally believed than this prophecy. It was backed up because early Africans regarded white as evil in itself. But now, you see, you due to our Mafia experience, we done been taught that black is death, devil, and evil. But for traditional African societies, I'm not going to say ubiquitously, but it's more reoccurring than it isn't, and is more of a common thread to African societies, no matter where you found them, that white resembles death or is the sign or symbol of death, right? He says this on 216. Nothing in Mossi land was better known and more universally believed than this prophecy. It was backed up because early Africans, early Africans, period, generally speaking, regarded white as evil in itself. Still, the young moderns, here we go, the young moderns could declare the prophecy to be just another old saying, manifestly untrue because some Arabs had been admitted into the country long ago and the nation still lived, stronger than ever. So it seemed. Gotta trust the wisdom of the ancestors and even improve on that wisdom. Don't ever go against the wisdom. You'll never go against the wisdom. You try to listen to that wisdom. If you ain't got nothing to offer to improve upon that wisdom, you don't go against the wisdom of the ancestors. But you have to get back into an intimate relationship with your ancestors, and you do so by studying. You do so by learning, because you're not gonna get this grounding in the institutions that are provided to you in the belly of the beast. It's not supposed to be institutions to free you. Should I even do these last two? But that was what I wanted to get to. That was the point I wanted to make. Here we go. Meanwhile, Europeans were closing in on the continent and had the Mossi states surrounded. The British on the Gold Coast and in Ashanti to the south, the Germans next door in Togoland, while the French were pressing down from the north and the Ivory Coast on the west. All had their agents busily gathering as much data as they could about this powerful and overly proud black nation. Talking about the Mossi states. At first, these agents had to operate from the outside. Dupuis from Ashanti, Coel from Sierra Leone, and Kraus from Togoland. There were many others. Kraus, a German in Togoland, was supposed to be the first European to slip into the country with a caravan. The great prophecy was now about to be fulfilled. Almost precisely. The first European had entered the country. The next white man came in boldly in 1888, backed by the supreme powers of the French Empire, albeit called a republic. This emissary of conquest was Louis Binger. He came to place the country under the protection of France. Here we go. He met a strong leader, still ready to fight, in the Magoho Naba Sano. And remember what Magoho Naba meant. Shit, I didn't take it too long. So I'm finding Naba obviously was governor. Naba was governor of a province. The Mongol Naba had no real authority outside his own Ouagadougou kingdom. Mongol Naba of the United Mossi. You gotta find out what Magoho means. Alright, but we'll go back to that. We know this is the title of kind of like the guy who only settles affairs, I believe. I don't want to assume. Dang, I have to read it. That's you. The village councils was the next political unit with an elected head man and a council of elders. The elders were the representatives of the village, of the various family sections or wards that made up the village. The village council was the center of authority, subject to the will of the community. The districts were the next and larger divisions, varying in size and having many villages and towns. The district Naba, or chief, was a very important official. Any number of districts made up of provinces and kingdoms which formed the nation. The great Nanims, plural for Naba, were elected by their respective councils and subject to their will. This latter fact was generally well disguised by ceremonial phraseology, ritual, and autocratic sounding decrees from the throne. Indeed, it was a general practice for both the council ministers and the people to proclaim the Magoho Naba has all power, is the most powerful king in the world over which he rules. So Magoho Naba is the name of the most powerful king, so that was the title of the king. But his powers were held in check because he, like they're going to say, indeed, and the people to proclaim that the Mogoho Naba has all power. It is the most powerful king in the world over which he rules. These functions seem to be one of the delights for the people. For did not these same fantastic claims hope to make the Wagadagu the Mogoho Naba? Indeed, during the periods African societies were most democratic, every effort seems to have been made to make it appear that the supreme power was exercised by the rulers, never by the people. That isn't true. This is what he's going on to say. Upon the death or removal of the Mogoho Naba, for example, there was the constitutional fiction that his successor must be chosen by the Widu Naba, which was the prime minister. And the Widu Naba made the public proclamation with all the ceremonial pomp and splendid ostentation befitting one charged with such an awesome responsibility as that of naming the next emperor. Yet everyone knew very well that the Widu Naba was merely announcing an election that had already been made by the council of the state. So like your group of elders, like I don't care if you think you're the chief of this neighborhood, the elders decide. But he also makes the point that even like with the consciousness of the community, of the civilization, of the society being so heightened that if you were over oral traditions and you were new to the position, if you said something that was inaccurate or it wasn't consistent with the history of that oral tradition, of those people, of their oral history, the common people in the crowd would be able to identify and detect that with their ear because their consciousness, their awareness of their own story, of their own people's history was as such a playing field that even the most common of men knew. So this is why the role of the chief is really just to articulate what the elders is saying, to speak on behalf of the people. You just the prop up. You know, but what happens when the people don't know? We have to, if you think you're a leader, you have to be working, raising a consciousness of our people, of the common man, so everybody is aware. You can't just be power hungry, wanting to delegate and give instructions. You have to be training people. In addition to these councils on various local levels, the Mossi developed another way of controlling the behavior of rulers. This was the practice of moving from one unsatisfactory village or district to a more favorable one. Whole villages might move from one district to another. No district chief could afford the district reflection on his ability to keep the people. The most important of his inauguration oaths. It also tended to undermine the economy of his area. The question of absolutism in traditional Africa is interesting because it so often means the very opposite of what it is understood by the term in Asia and the West. In seven different societies covered in my field studies in different regions, all declared that their traditional kings had absolute powers as rulers. Follow-up analysis revealed that what was meant was that the chiefs or kings had absolute power to carry out the clearly understood will of the people, which, of course, is a far cry from self-assumed absolutism. There was no absolutism in Western terms. Even Shaka of the great Zulu Empire complained because the council failed to check him in his excesses. He expected some control and guidance. This control was not attempted by a council overawed by his greatness as a leader. As indicated elsewhere, my studies show that factors such as the Zululand situation helped to explain the decline of ancient African democratic systems. Asia and Europe were not responsible for everything that happened adversely. This we must know. This is why this is such a great book. Because it not only exposes you to the travesties that are constant causes for our devastation, but it also puts that mirror on you to make you see how we have participated in their demise. Like, the Zululand situation should not be, like, our elders still need to have that chief, that representative in check. He must submit to the powers of the people, ultimately. But the people's consciousness must be raised again. This is why the role of the teacher is so important in my estimation. Because how do we get back to the place like Nana Chancellor Williams talks about in Destruction, where even our oral tradition, our oral history, if we heard it back, if we heard any facts, any truth, any knowledge, anything, we were just aware, we were conscious again, every one of us, with some common core standard of consciousness. All right? Then he goes on to say, the Mossi became the outstanding horse breeding country. The finest, swiftest breeds became their specialty. It was probably from this fact that they had dashing cavalry forces that so often carried them to victory and protected their homeland from conquest for over 500 years. There was a great outside demand for Mossi horses and donkeys. These became an important fact in one of the most economically advanced countries in Africa. We turn next to their economic enterprise and the prosperity that flowed from it as still another illustration of what black people can do on their own initiative without the aid of or even having seen a white man. And that's where I'm going to stop, because that's 40 minutes on just breaking down a couple pages and going into it. But destruction of black civilization, man. We must study, we must learn from our past, our story. We must know our story intimately. And we must fight for the liberation of our people. One cause, one goal, one destiny. One people, one African people, one Pan-African people. Pan meaning all African people that are African people. Black African people. No matter where you find yourself. I share. A BB48.